let's talk about what PHP calls functions. Okay, back in the day when I first started programming, and long before me, we called them subroutines, okay? Because when you thought about code, you said we're going to run tasks, and those are going to be routines or recipes that we're going to run, okay? And then we would break up our code into what would be called subroutines, sub-recipes, sub-task. Now we just call them functions, all right? And what that does is this. Let's just take a look. So if I'm looking at this particular function right here, it's declaring that it's a function, okay? And then we give it a name, and then all the code that goes from this curly brace to the closing curly brace, all of this code here, I'll just highlight it. Let me come up. All of this belongs to that function, okay? It will not run until that function is called. All right, do you hear me? So when the program loads up, this function, if it's not called, this code's not going to run until somewhere in the code it gets called. Then it will run. For example, this function right here is in WordPress Core. All right, so if I open that up, and by the way, it's in WP includes, and that's in theme.php. That's the file. And go to about line 855 in there, and you'll find where that function's at. Here it is right here. So WordPress Core loads first, then it calls the plugins, and it calls the theme. Okay, so now it's already loaded into memory. That function declaration is loaded into memory so that PHP knows how to find it when you call it. Okay, so now we go and we use it in our theme, and we say, hey, I need to get a theme mod. Would you please run this function for me, this task for me? And in PHP, we call that a function. Okay, does that make sense to you? All right, I'll put it side by side. Maybe this will help a little bit. So here is how we run that code. I need to emphasize this. You may know this, but if you don't, then this is a good exercise for you. So think about a definition, some sort of declaration. If this file was not loaded yet, but yet I tried to call a function, PHP is going to be really mad at you because it doesn't know what this particular function is. It needs to go look it up. Okay, so it looks in memory in where it's storing all the functions at, and it looks for that name. It gets stored into memory when we declare it like this. Okay, so we have a keyword here, then we have a name, and then we have our code block to say all the code from the opening to closing curly braces. Yeah, I'm going to store that away. I know how to go and find that now so that when you call it like this, notice that you're calling it just by its name. You see that? Okay, so right here, I'm using it. And when I type out that name, it's this name right here, same name. Okay, so I'm saying, okay, I now want to run this code. Hello. So when PHP gets to right here, it's going to go and call this function. Okay, you get that? All right, if not, come ask me. All right, next, let's look at the syntax. So we've got a keyword function. That's how we're saying to PHP, this is a function. Then we give it a name that we specify. Now look at the name. There's no $sign in the front of it. That's only a variable. Okay. And it has similar naming criteria that we did here. So we can't start with a number. Nope. We can't start with a £sign or a question mark. Nope. So use the same naming convention that we talked about in variables. Just don't have that $sign. All right. Next, we have parentheses. All functions will have parentheses. Okay, notice we know that that is a function. It has parentheses. Even if there's nothing, see, this one has two variables in it. This one has none. So even if there aren't any variables, the syntax is you still have to have these parentheses, period. Have to have them, okay? That's part of the syntax. Next, we have our opening See, opening, curly brace, and then you have the closing, and then all the code that's in between that belongs to that function. Okay. Now, let's talk about, this one has no parameters. This one has two. That's 1 and 2. Let's talk about those. So why would you have parameters here in a function? Why? Well, because the function is doing something. It needs information coming in to process it. In this case, it would be some configuration information. Okay, so think about that. If I want to configure something, I need to tell it what I want. This is a getter. It says get the theme modification. And I want a specific one. So I'll tell you what the mod is by its name. Okay, so I'm going to pass in page layout, right? That gets passed into the name. If I can draw a line there, boy, that was a bad line. Okay, so that gets passed into this variable and gets assigned to it. Now I can use that in the code. Okay, remember us talking about how you assign variables. You have this equal to sign. Okay, and then it says, okay, I'm going to bind that. Well, same thing here, except it's just an implied equal. So we're taking that value and now we're going to bind it to this parameter over here. Okay, how about this other one? Notice that it has an equal and it has a value. Why? Okay, well, this one is required. You have to send me a name. I don't know what you want. If you don't send me a name, I don't know what to do. Okay, so the other one, though, is a default. And it will already have a value. So it's being set up that if you don't send me one, see, I didn't send a second one. I didn't have a comma and a second one going in, then it just uses the default value that's been set. Otherwise, it uses what you pass to it. So if this had, well, page layout, I just want an empty string back, then default here would be set to an empty string. Okay. And then these variables, as I said, will be used within the code in that function. Does that make sense to you? Okay. The key point here is this. One is the syntax. Okay, so that's one, so that you know how to define a function. 2 is that how do you call it? And 3 is that some functions need information. They need stuff for them to work. Okay, here, I need to know what one you want me to go get. In some cases, I need some incoming data. Maybe I pulled it from the database, and then I want to go and clean it up, such as if I'm doing an escape HTML. Right? Well, I need the HTML that you want me to go clean up. I need that passed to me. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, let's do one of these ourselves. All right, so I'm going to close that out. Now, just like we did before, go to the very tippy top of your functions.php file, whatever theme that you're using. Make sure that you go below the opening PHP tag. And then let's do this. We're going to define a function. Ready? We're going to say function. This is my first function. And then don't put anything in there and go like that. You just defined a function. All right. So let's go and just do a D. You called me. Okay. So then what we're going to do is let's call this thing. So we need that. Just copy it. And then the parentheses let us know, the parentheses let PHP know, this is a function. Go look it up. Okay. So now let's go ahead. We're going to refresh and see if this works. Matter of fact, let's do a DDD so it stops executing. Okay. Go ahead and do that. Are you ready to run it? All right, let's go. Refresh. You called me. Okay. Very, very simple. Now let's add something. Let's change this to add numbers. Okay, and then I'm going to say this will be number 1, and this one will be number 2. I want to add 2 numbers together. Okay, so we're just going to say add numbers. Then what we're going to do is say a return, and we're going to take number 1 plus number 2. Okay, just like that. Now, in math, we might even say this is X and this is Y, that we're adding two numbers together. And because this is a math function, you could do that. In this case, I'm just going to call them number 1, number 2. Okay. Then we need to actually go and call this thing. So here, we'll say total equals. And then we're going to put in 10 and 20. We want to add those two together. And then let's just go and take the total out of it. Let's see what happens. Ready? Let's run this. Run, you get 30. Okay. So you see how we pass this in. Well, let's do one more thing. Let's go and say we're going to do number 3 here, but we're going to set that to a 0. So if you don't pass me a third one, I won't add it. It'll just be 0. Okay, so then I can go number 3. So in this case, what will it be? Well, here, I'm going to get rid of that, and let's just wrap this in D. Like this. Okay, and then we'll do it again. We're going to call it a second time. And this time we're going to go, just leave it like that. And then we'll pass in a 5. So what's the value going to be the first time we call it? It'll be 30, right? Because we're going 10, 20, and 0. The second time we call it, it will be 10, 20, and 5. So it'll be 35. Do you agree with me? Well, let's run it and see what happens. Refresh. There you go. Those are our values that we got back. Does this make sense to you? Okay, I know it's very, very basic, but seriously, declaring a function is a pretty basic thing. What you do in the function now, that can be pretty complex to very, very simple. Just depends upon your application. Here, I'm trying to give you just a very brief overview of PHP just to get you rolling on some of the features of it, which are functions in this case. Now, you might be wondering about that return. It does just what it says. Okay, it returns the value. So I'm adding these numbers together. The result of that then is returned back to whoever called it. Okay, does that make sense? If not, come and ask me. So what are your key takeaways from this? Okay, you declare a function by just saying the keyword function. You give it a name, right? You can have parameters or not, and this is the information that it needs to do its work. If you have them, you can have one or as many as you want, and if you have more than one, use a comma to separate them. You can have some set as an optional, and then set a value for them if they're optional. And by the way, something that you need to know too, optional ones have to come last. So required, and then any optionals need to be the last in the parameter list here. Okay, so this is a parameter list. It's a list of variables that you need. So if you hear me say parameter list, that's what I mean. Okay, and then you can pass in by calling it. So you call this way just by using that name, use parentheses, and then you can pass in if there's anything required. Notice here, we did not pass in the optional one, number 3. Over here, we did. Okay, does this make sense to you? The other thing to know is that these curly braces decide what code belongs to that function. So this code right here belongs to that function. This will not run until you call it. Okay, got it? Excellent job.